Hi everyone, Magnus here, coming back just after the live broadcast of the Speed Chess Championship semi-finals between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann. The match did not disappoint. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of the match scores and how it went to start things off, and then I have got 3 games that I've selected, one from the 5-minute blitz, one from the 3-minute blitz, and another from the 1-minute bullet. Now, starting off in the 5-minute blitz, there was a very shaky game one between Magnus and Hans. Magnus went for quite a non-confrontational double fianchetto setup, ended up losing an exchange, but Hans ended up getting his rook trapped, which Magnus proceeded to win and then convert the game. And really, this was sort of the story for much of the 5-minute portion. There was some pretty close matches after that, with a draw here and there, but now we move into this game where Magnus put his foot down and really started attacking. So let's get into it. Magnus starts with an English setup. He sort of goes for this reversed Sicilian, which we've seen quite a bit between these two, and also in the Hikaru Furuja match earlier today. Knight to c3. Magnus going for this Botvinnik setup, advancing his pawns, potentially looking for e5, rook e1, h4, h5 maybe, and he really just wants to maybe close up the center and checkmate Hans on the king side. So he does play e5, knight d7, and h4. H4 is a very standard move in these sort of King's Indian attack setups. This is very reminiscent of the French defense against the King's Indian attack, except it's an improved version because there's already this pawn on c4, so you can't really get rolling with these queenside pawns like you normally would. So, after h4, Hans goes for b6, looking to possibly get his bishop out and start expanding. Magnus plays rook e1, a standard move. Hans goes bishop b7. Captures, and d4. Magnus locks down the position. This is actually very, very useful information for those of you that want to learn how to do good attacking chess. You want to close down the center. That way you don't have to worry about all the pieces getting active. And also it makes it much more congested for the black pieces to make their way over to the king. As you can see, they're all the way over here. And with the center is locked like this, it's much more difficult for, say, a bishop to come and aid in the defense. So Magnus shuts things down. Hans gets his bishop to c6, potentially looking to start trying to expand these pawns over here. Magnus goes knight g5 now. And the idea is that he potentially wants to get his queen into h5 to d3. He wants to start targeting and try and force some weaknesses from black. Now, black should probably play h6, but I'm guessing Hans was concerned about creating a hook in the future for Magnus. So he opted not to touch the kingside pawns and just start expanding on the queen side. Magnus goes queen h5, forcing bishop takes, and after bishop takes, he has to move the queen, and this is already looking very scary. Magnus can remaneuver his knight in. Potentially he can go for f4, bring in the other rook, and things are looking dangerous. He goes queen g4, threatening bishop h6, which would win a rook. Hans plays king h8, getting out of danger, and now rook c1. A nice move here. Magnus potentially threatening to go knight e4 with a discovery on the bishop. If he wants to go for the d6 square, could be very nice. Knight to b6, and Magnus goes knight to e2, given that the bishop has been defended by the knight moving out of the way. The queen now defends the bishop. But Magnus is going knight to e2 to h5, to f4, sorry, and then we'll jump into f6, potentially with a sacrifice looking to get the bishop onto this checkmate position. So Hans jumps into b5, Magnus goes knight f4, Hans takes the knight, and instead of reacting to the knight attacking the rook here, Magnus finds knight to h5. Lovely move here. If you take the rook, then there's bishop f6. Nice stuff, with a checkmate on g7. So instead of taking the rook, Hans tries to cover up with rook to g8, but Magnus doesn't stop pounding. He plays knight to f6. As you can already see, dominant game here. Hans down to 7 seconds left on his clock. Magnus still with 3 minutes pretty much in a 5-minute game. This was actually a pretty standard time disparity between the two. Hans was often getting down to just a couple seconds on his clock, still making good moves, by the way. But Magnus, with his extra time, is really close to unstoppable. As you can see, 3,300 blitz rating compared to Hans's not too shabby 3,150 as well. But that is just that is just an outstanding blitz rating. But after knight to f6, we get queen f8. Hans says goodbye to his rook, but Magnus, just plays queen h5, simple chess, going for the checkmate here. If you were to take, then the bishop will take with check. Apparently, there was a killer move: knight takes h7, king takes, and queen h5 mate. I'm not really sure what Magnus didn't like about that. Maybe pawn to f5, he was a little bit concerned, and g6. That could have been something. And okay, queen e8 here. So maybe he was concerned about f5. But he plays it simple. Rook g7 and rook takes c6. Magnus is equal material, but this rook is forever pinned. And you can simply, kick these knights, take this guy. I mean, the rook's available at any time. Hans plays knight c4 and throws in the towel with 2 seconds left at the same time. So, quite an eventful game in the 5+1 portion. Hans was on the back foot ever since this one in 5+1. Magnus racks up a +5 lead heading into the 3-minute portion. Now, the 3-minute portion was actually extremely back and forth between the two, ending on 4-4 either side. And I'm just going to show you one of the games. Magnus was saving a lot of bad positions in this one. Hans was letting them slip just a little bit. If Hans hadn't let them slip, maybe this would be a different match that we were talking about if he could have got some more momentum going. But okay, Magnus plays this kind of sideline with bishop to b5 and a4. I actually lost quite a nasty classical game playing the black pieces against this setup. So knight f6, Magnus defends his pawn, and he starts launching forward this a pawn, which I find really annoying because I don't like having this a7 pawn undefended. And if you play a6, then you create a permanent hook on the b6 square, a long-term weakness. So after bishop g7, a6, and now if you go b6, trying to close things down, bishop c6, all of a sudden comes, and I guess knight to b5 goes after the pawn can't be defended. Okay, so instead of that, Hans just leaves the structure as it is, decides to castle. Magnus castles, queen to c7, and we get an exchange of the pieces. Magnus pushes the pawn 2 squares forward, inciting Hans to do the classic end peasant move, capturing the pawn after it moves 2 squares. Given that they're in France, Hans felt obliged, captured on d3, c takes d3, and queen to b7. Now, the structure is as follows. It's basically just b pawn versus a pawn. The b pawn is slightly less weak, I would say, but really, this should be equal. Rook goes back to a3 as it was attacked. Hans brings his other rook in, h3, knight c5, putting the horsey on a good square. Queen to e2 by Magnus. I guess he's potentially looking to go e5 in the future. And he goes pawn to d4, kicking this knight away. But maybe he just missed and blundered the pawn. I don't really know what to say. He might have missed the fact that the queen... Actually, he probably just missed the fact that the rook is pressuring this bishop here. So, for example, if you take here, and not queen takes, sorry, knight takes, there would be queen takes e4, takes, and rook takes c1, free pawn, and black would simply win after collecting this guy, and then the f2 pawn would be loose as well. So after Magnus, after the brilliant move, knight takes e4 from Hans. Hans was fighting here. Magnus does take back, but he doesn't go all the way. He just develops a bishop instead. He's down a clean pawn, does trade into this endgame. Magnus accepts the fact that he's losing the fork. This wasn't a blunder. This was calculated by Magnus. And we end up in this endgame where you would say, okay, Magnus has no shot at winning this. Hans with the black pieces, up an exchange. He's going to pick off these pawns. He's going to try and get the F pawn, and then he's going to win the 3-on-2. At least that is the plan. Hans delivers a check. Apparently the best move is rook to a8, trying to exchange off the rooks. If you were to go rook b7, then you would once again offer the exchange of rooks, and if the rook moves away, you would capture the b pawn. So this was the best option, but Hans delivers a check and then takes the b pawn. But Magnus goes knight e5. I'm imagining this is what Hans missed. This is a nice move, because if you were to take the f2 pawn, there would be knight to d3 with a fork, and this would just be a draw. So instead of that, Hans stacks up his rooks, but Magnus captures the pawn and then defends his f-pawn with the king. And all of a sudden, it looks like it might be white here who's pressing for the win, with the knight coming back potentially into h6, and he can really consolidate all of these pieces. Magnus will be 2 pawns up. Check, and moves back. Hans starts attacking the rook, but as you can notice, look at the time disparity. 2 seconds for Hans, 1 minute 30 for Magnus. This, you just can't. You can't deal with these sharp positions with just 2 seconds on your clock. I mean, Hans just had to speed up in this match. That was really just the main takeaway. Magnus goes into this endgame. He's got 2 pawns. Goes back to defend his pawn, and an immediate blunder, understandably, from Hans. 2 seconds on his clock is simply not enough. Try and spot it for yourselves. It's knight to f6, and after the king moves, simple fork here, knight to e4. Hans just let his time run and was probably getting a little bit frustrated at this point that he was letting all of these chances slip away from him. Now, onto the bullet once again. Hans actually had scored a nice game initially, but Magnus really started pounding away at the bullet. He built up a huge lead at one point, almost 10 games, I think, might have been 9. But that lead also slipped away near the end, and I think the score ended up being about +5 for Magnus. But just thought I'd show you guys this game. It was a nice game in the bullet section. We get a London system by Magnus. He seems to quite like this in the fast time controls. Knight f3, h3. Magnus gets the bishops, and he gives back the bishop. But he gets this nice bind on the center with these 2 pawns staring into the e5 square. Black can never really push. Black has to rely on c5. And yeah, as the engine points out, queen b6, rook c8, and try and get some counterplay down the c file. Magnus just brings his pieces towards the center, not concerned about the b pawn, by the way, because then there would be rook to b1, and actually bishop takes h7. Nasty, nasty stuff. The queen was actually trapped. That's a crazy line. But of course, Hans doesn't fall for this. He is a super GM after all, and instead goes for c5, striking in the center. Magnus captures, goes rook b1 because now the pawn is really hanging, and after some other moves are played, knight for bishop gets exchanged. Magnus finds this nice move f5 after the weakening move f6. Not really sure why Hans played this one. Seems like a bit of a weird decision. I thought you might just want to move the rook to an open file. But f6 is the choice of Hans. Magnus meets it with f5. If you were to push forward, Magnus would jump in and grab the d-pawn. So Hans decides to take. Magnus takes with the knight. Knight f5, by the way. Really dangerous pony over there. Targeting the g7 pawn, potentially going for some forks here. If you defend with the queen, there's even queen sacrifices followed by knight e7. So, for example, queen d6, not queen d6, queen c6, not queen c6. Honestly, how do you defend this pawn? It seems really difficult to defend the pawn with the queen, so I'm struggling to show it. Here we go. Something like this, you could in fact sacrifice the queen. At least I thought you could. What's the problem? Oh, knight d2 is hanging. So at the end of all this, there would be a fork on the 2 rooks. But I was just trying to point out that the queen can, on some occasions, sacrifice itself when it's not a double question mark, when the rooks are out of trouble. Okay, So knight f5 was played, queen e6, and Magnus goes knight e3, regrouping and pressuring the isolated queen's pawn there. Stacks up the rooks, just claims the free pawn, queen f3 and c4. Magnus has consolidated his dominant pony in the center of the board. He's going to go queen g3, rook e1, and maybe not to that square, but he's going to get an attack going on the black king. Given that it's a bullet, it's extremely hard to defend. Queen g3, and now the threats are serious. Magnus is threatening knight f6 with the jumbo fork, attacking all of the major pieces. Hans tries to defend himself with queen to e7, but this just makes the situation worse. Knight e7 check. A nice knight sacrifice by Magnus. Not really a sacrifice, because after the rook would take, a simple rook takes, king f7, and I guess something like queen to b8 would get the job done. Magnus could checkmate on the back rank. So it was in this position that Hans resigned, given that he was going to lose the knight. Now, after this game, Hans went on to lose a couple more games before making a fairly strong comeback with, I think, 3 or 4 wins in a row near the end, but it simply wasn't enough. Magnus's lead was too big, and we're going to be very excited to see a Magnus Ferrugia match tomorrow, as well as a Hans versus Hikaru, for the third place. So that will be great to see. Now, if you guys did enjoy this recap, please do consider liking and subscribing. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!